Hi. Oh my God, I like completely forgot to press record. So again, um, we had so my friend group and I had a presentation night on the 26th of December, and I felt maybe I should share my presentation with the world because I'm quite happy with it. Again, I have to preface this by saying that this is like the fourth time I've tried recording this. Like at each stage, at each stage I've just messed up in a different way. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is that I am not an expert in performance art history, especially with regard to opera. So I don't really title myself as a someone that should be respected or like a voice that should be listened to in this discussion. And at the same time, this is by no means a rigorously academic presentation because, I mean, there are citations, but they're not properly cited. I will put the links in the description below, though, that's for sure. But without further ado, let's get this started. Great. And I think the subtitles are there too, so they are hopefully going to be recorded. Um, so again, my presentation is on Lucia's ascent into madness. Her madness as a vehicle for her emancipation in the opera Lucia di Lammermoor. And ascent was a deliberate textual choice. So maybe I will kind of expound on that further on in this presentation. So I won't get too into it now in the interest of making this coherent and in the interest of time as well. And I would like to say that I do go on and run on a lot with like speaking. So it's like you have to kind of bypass all of the waffle, the drivel to get to like the point of what I'm saying, which is really like if you know, you know, I have ADHD and like I don't speak like a normal person, I speak like a babbling brook. So without further ado, let's get into Lucia di Lammermoor. So, a little bit about the history and the background story of this opera. For people who aren't familiar with the text, it premiered in 1835. It was composed by Gaetano Donizetti, written by Salvatore Camerano. It's based on The Bride of Lammermoor in 1819 by Sir Walter Scott, a novel with characters Lucy Ashton and Edgar Ravenswood, which have been adapted into Italian Lucia and Edgardo. Um, I have to say that this was a novel that was loosely based on some historical event, although, of course, Sir Walter Scott and Donizetti and Camerano do take some creative liberties that delineate from the actual event, novel. And so we can kind of investigate some of that later on. Um, let's get into the conflicting historical settings of Lucia de Lammermoor, the opera. And that is because there is a debate over what the actual historical backdrop of this opera is. And I will just kind of bring up the opera bill. It's not really a play bill, but it's an opera bill for the performance that I watched. And in this performance, they actually use King James the Seventh as the kind of background for the setting. And canonically, I think I lean towards the portrayal of Mary Queen of Scots' escape to France, and then later her marriage to Francis II as the background of Scotland, because upon returning to Scotland, there was a struggle for the throne due to her being recognized as a Roman Catholic, whereas Scotland was predominantly Protestant. Um, and then later on, this adaptation that I watched, they actually used King James VII, who was a king, and he was Roman Catholic. And he was deposed during the Glorious Revolution in 1688 because of his Catholic background. So that meant he believed in absolutism, and he believed that he, as the king, had the divine right of kings, which gave him absolute power. Obviously, that was kind of a struggle between him and his daughter Mary II, as well as her husband William of Orange. And they were both Protestant of a Calvinist sect. So within this adaptation that I watched in Hong Kong, the tutor and the chaplain, Raimondo, that serves the Ashton family, is actually a Protestant chaplain of the Calvinist sect. And so William and Mary succeeded the throne and became the king and queen consort of England, Ireland, and Scotland in 1689. Um, so let's get more into why Lucia di Lammermoor is such a staple of opera. That is because it boasts like a lot of the sort of dramatic plot points, such as the star-crossed lovers, that are doomed by the plot. If you love a doomed romance, this is definitely something that you might enjoy. I'd like to comment on the fact that this opera kind of combines several elements of a few of Shakespeare's plays, namely Ophelia and Hamlet, who you can draw parallels with Lucia, because they both go mad and they die in a pretty tragic way. Oh, spoiler alert, by the way. And as well as Romeo and Juliet, who are star-crossed lovers. Edgardo mentions that upon laying eyes on Lucia, he forgets his like I guess you can say his vengeance to kill and eliminate the entire Ashton family. Um, and at the same time, there are some supernatural elements from Macbeth, um, supernatural elements in Lucia di Lammermoor that mirror Macbeth, with the witches as well as like hallucinations. So we'll get into that later on, but right now I just want to introduce the characters, the central characters, namely one, the titular heroine, Miss Lucia of the Ashton family. So she is the sister of Enrico Ashton, and he arranged Lucia's marriage with Lord Arturo Bucklaw, a nobleman in kind of this like pursuit of a political gain for not only him, but for the family. Not justified in any way. I definitely don't agree with his actions. So Enrico's political desires again inadvertently catalyzed the tragic events of the opera, but I wouldn't say inadvertently because I do think that he caused a lot of this. And even though he did not intend for Lucia to go mad, he was the reason. Um, so I think I would disagree with the way that I wrote inadvertently. He caused that shit. Anyway, the Ashtons are Protestants. Enrico is concerned if the clan's ruin should Mary Stuart ascend to the throne. This is in the opera, but also referenced in Pottinger's text, which I do include in a lot of my slides and the following ones. So thank you, Pottinger. Again, Edgardo Ravenswood, he is Miss Lucia's lover. So he is the last remaining member of the Ravenswood family, whose clan supported Mary Stuart or Mary Queen of Scots, so we know them as Roman Catholics. Edgardo is prepared to leave for a political mission in France to secure Scotland's future, which is why we believe that it cements the opera in the time of Mary Queen of Scots. Presumably for the Catholic cause and to highlight a sympathetic connection to Mary Stuart and her fight for legitimacy. At the same time, it is important to state that perhaps most of the audience that watched this in the 19th century, those Italian audiences were presumably of the Catholic faith. And so this not only strikes a sympathetic connection to Mary Stuart's fight for legitimacy, but it also gives them reason to empathize and sympathize with Edgardo, who is another person of the Roman Catholic or Catholic faith. Let's move on. So in this slide here is Dear Maria Callas. Um, like gorgeous, first of all, but also this is her portrayal of Lucia. And so in this series of pictures, you can see Lucia being married off to Arturo, and on her face, she is like distraught. She is confused. She is very saddened. She is grieving. And so you can understand that at that time, Lucia, when married off to Arturo, she was not in the correct state of mind to give her consent. So I'll explain a little bit more about the story between Lucia and Edgardo. So in the fountain scene in the first act, Lucia promises herself to Edgardo after he proposes to her. Edgardo intended to ask for Enrico's permission, but Lucia decides against it for fear of Edgardo getting into mortal danger or peril. And so Edgardo leaves for France, and in that time, the clan knows of their tryst. And as such, Enrico and another person within the Ashton clan forges a letter that proves of Edgardo's infidelity. And as such, Lucia is deeply saddened and like racked with grief, devastation. And so at that moment, they swoop in. And in the adaptation that I watched, um, they actually guide her hand in this like towards the marriage contract and sign on her behalf using her hand, but Lucia never gives her explicit consent prior and never gives her explicit consent even then. It is just because that she is so preoccupied with her grief that she is totally unable to put a stop to the events. She is barely conscious to what's going on around her. Um, and so at the marriage ceremony, Edgardo rushes in because he hears of Lucia marrying Arturo, and he believes that she has been unfaithful to him. And so, because of that, he curses her and he leaves, but he is very, very devastated as well because he loves Lucia. And she realizes the whole time that Enrico and the people around her have lied to her about Edgardo's infidelity, and as such, she is driven to even deeper despair. So the whole situation is very tragic. There is a chorus, and they all like mirror the kind of like reaction to everything that's unfolding, and so it's just a lot. And you can imagine Lucia is going through a lot of pressure and grief. So let's move on. Um, I'm gonna cut the video in here, but this is a televised, I think, performance of Dame Joan Sutherland's portrayal of Lucia. Um, and she sings Il Dolce Suono. So I'm gonna move forward to the next slide. Uh, I'll just kind of like briefly recap the plot that is unfolding at the moment. So Lucia, in her despair, is reluctantly escorted to her marriage chamber with Arturo. Um, Raimondo, the chaplain and the tutor for the Ashton family, announces to the still jubilant chorus that in her madness, Lucia fatally stabbed Arturo. And so afterwards, Lucia emerges from atop a staircase, and as she descends and enters the Ashton Castle slash estate, um, like the grand foyer, she sings of her and Edgardo's marriage that she hallucinates in her state of psychosis. And so the songs are as follows. Parte d'immenso giubilo, that is sung by the chorus, and it is their moment of immense jubilation at the ceremony of Lucia and Arturo's marriage. Dalle stanze ove Lucia, sung by Raimondo, tells the chorus of the scene after Lucia kills Arturo. She has a pale face and she has this really haunted smile on her face as well. And afterwards, Il Dolce Suono is when Lucia emerges at the landing and she starts descending the staircase while hallucinating her blessed marriage with Edgardo. So, I would also like to mention the phantasmagorical and fantastical elements in Lucia di Lammermoor. So, in that scene in the first act, when Lucia is waiting for Edgardo at the fountain, she's actually accompanied by her handmaid Alisa. And so she recounts the tale of her seeing a female phantom she saw near the fountain of the Ashton family estate. And there is a story behind this phantom, which talks about this woman who has a jealous lover who thought that she was unfaithful to them. And as such, their lover killed her in a jealous rage and threw her body into the fountain. And as such, this ghost's vision is a foreboding omen that precedes the demise of both Lucia and her lover Edgardo. Um, Conflict arises in my head after watching this, whether the supernatural elements exist in the setting of Lucia di Lammermoor or whether Lucia was already experiencing symptoms of a psychotic illness like hallucination. Of course, these are not mutually exclusive and two things can exist at once. That Lucia saw a vision of a phantom and then later on was driven to a breaking point where her mind fractured and she experienced full-on psychosis. Um, it just kind of like I'm not sure, and there are very many ways that we can read this opera. In my head, I feel like because she was able to recount so faithfully the details of the phantom, that perhaps supernatural elements do exist, and maybe she was possibly conscious during the slaying of Arturo. I know I'm reaching here, but this, again, I'm not an authority on opera and how to read opera, but this is kind of how I came away with it. And let's move on. So I would kind of like to draw in the Gothic horror, the sublime, and a little bit of comparative literature to kind of discuss The Bride of Lammermoor and Lucia de Lammermoor. So The Bride of Lammermoor by Walter Scott follows on the heels of the more famous novel by Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus in 1818, which I think many of you might have watched the movie by Guillermo del Toro. Love that movie, by the way. Great adaptation. So Shelley's Gothic novel reveals a similar fascination with the socio-political environment of the early Enlightenment, as well as the specters of madness, murder, and the private lives of individuals caught up in vengeful forces beyond their control. So again, this kind of brings in the idea of Macbeth, of fate, of destiny, as well as like omens, foretellings, and all of that situation that kind of precedes the doomed romance of Lucia and Edgardo. There's also kind of like the murder aspect, who is complicit in what, such as Enrico. He, though does not intend to, drives Lucia to her madness. So there's this kind of struggle of the characters against a bigger um, planned destiny, as well as their struggle against the hidden externalities of their actions. And that is something that is very compelling and endures, that leads to Lucia de Lammermoor becoming a very recognized staple within pop culture history, but also in opera. And I say pop culture history because Lucia's Madness aria has been adapted and referenced in pop culture, namely in The Fifth Element by the director that will not be named. Um, and so you may have heard of it even if you don't know the background or the title. But yeah, let's move on. So I will also want to tie in hysteria, insanity, and madness. Like the romantic portrayals of madness, first of all, but also to define hysteria, because Lucia is described as hysterical, as mad, um, in this play, and I just kind of want to get into the medical history as well. An interesting fact about Lucia di Lammermoor is that the composer Donizetti was actually suffering from syphilis-induced hallucinations. So that may have inspired the, I guess you can say the hallucinations and I guess, the overall course of the opera. And I'm pretty sure, I think he later on died of syphilis. So hysteria, insanity, and madness. I won't really elaborate on insanity, but I did want to talk about insanity not being a clinical term for diagnosis, rather it being used in the setting of a courthouse. So, say in criminal court, the insanity plea. Um, and I will later on elaborate on hysteria and madness kind of together, but mostly on hysteria. So, hysteria. You can see the way that, oh, and by the way, this image was a reenactment of hysteria of the female body. Hysteria was historically associated with females, especially with their biological functions. Um, and I will elaborate on that later on, but we can kind of understand the way that madness, especially hysteria, has been understood in a gendered connotation, and also of its romanticism of psychological pain and illness. So, here are some examples of the way that artists have portrayed hysteria and madness. Um, Louise Bourgeois' Arch of Hysteria, namely, is a very apt example of like hysteria and women. Partially because she actually lived through a hysterical diagnosis and was subjected to electroshock therapy herself. And so she made this arch to kind of recount and tie in her experiences of hysteria, but you can understand this genderless figure in the so-called iconic arch of hysteria is a sort of commentary on how it was associated with women, but in reality, it is a result of the unwillingness to diagnose and understand more about people's mental illnesses and health, and that it pertains to people of all gender identities, not just women. So, Ophelia Ophelia, I did mention prior that she and Lucia's character have some parallels between them. And that is something that I do want to kind of raise in this like slide of art history and the way that artists depict madness and hysteria. In some ways, they could romanticize it, they could mock it inadvertently, or they try to present it as it is, as a lived experience, as someone on the outside looking in. So you can see that these terms are quite contested in the fact that there is so much of a varied representation of hysteria and madness. So let's move on. I will now look at the etymology of hysteria, and courtesy of Etim Online. So hysteria and hysterical, the noun and adjective. It has its roots in medical Latin as an abstract noun from the Greek hystera, womb, and it is used to describe a nervous disease. And so you can see that there is like some variance of uterus and utero, abdomen, womb, and stomach. And so it was originally defined as a neurotic condition peculiar to women and thought to be caused by a dysfunction of the uterus. And it suggests a general sense of unhealthy emotion or excitement. But you can see from the Latin hystericus of the womb, from Greek hystericos of the womb, suffering in the womb. it suggests a biological dysfunction with the person that has a womb. Um, and as such, it has led to its association, unfortunately, with people that possess a womb and a uterus. And so, because of that, there has been an unfair treatment of these people, especially when, like, in the diagnosis process, you just write them off for experiencing some sort of nervous disease, whereas it's a much larger predicament and illness and pain that they're suffering. And I kind of want to tie in that sort of like modern understanding of medical or systematic racism, especially with regard to, or like not racism, but like medical discrimination, because it pertains to people of a marginalized group who have been traditionally, unfortunately, dismissed, ignored, and completely shunned in the space of medical treatment. And it's way harder for them to receive proper care and diagnosis, and has led to many unfortunate deaths, um, misdiagnoses, mistreatments, and more suffering and pain. And that is something that needs to be said. So now, this final slide on oh, actually, no, not the final. Well, I mean, yes, this is the final, but this is not my final point. Let's go back to that. Hysteria was only removed from the DSM in 1980. So that means that if you have friends in their early 40s, or if you are in your early 40s, this could have preceded you. Um, Hysteria was only removed from the DSM in 1980 upon the third revision of the DSM. So that is really horrific and scary to think, because it's much more recent than you think it is. I mean, I think Beetlejuice also came out around the 80s, so it's like impossible to wrap my head around that. I mean, it's bamboozling, that's for sure. Anyway. So beyond the literary sources for the libretto, the opera also bears witness to the use of medical knowledge in defining the appearance and sound of a mentally ill young woman who has succumbed to hysteria. Um, so according to the medical treatises of the time, hysteria was a disease that bore physical and emotional symptoms, the severity of which could be diagnosed with a relatively new invention of the stethoscope in 1816. So, there's this kind of interesting backdrop of Donizetti's own syphilis-induced hallucinations, as his work premiered during a time of heightened listening, whereby audiences sought to hear within the notes of the music the inner world of the composer or the performer, the sound of pain or latent disease that was now understood to reflect a lexicon of medically understood sounds that reveal themselves to the careful listener. So, there's this one part of Lucia's aria where she sings accompanied by a glass harmonica, armonica. And that is like a very tech technically hard part of that performance, because there is a lot of coloratura, which is a performance with a lot of spikes and highs and lows, just a roller coaster of breath control and pitch and all of that. So, one example being the Magic Flute, um, very famously performed by Diana Damrau. I mean, excellent performance, first of all. And anyway, but yes, so I think Donizetti wanted to invoke that sort of like erratic sound or screams that emerge from a person experiencing such immense psychological pain. And he wanted to kind of imbue that into Lucia and express that through her performance. Anyway, let's understand Lucia's characterization. So up until this point, which is the breaking point in the opera and the cathartic point in the plot, Lucia has been understood as a caged bird and presented as a victim of circumstance who has to play into gender roles that are, well, like historical implications of like gender roles expected of women at the time, or like in that setting, because this is historical fiction. But she is also surrounded by machismo characters who infringe on her agency and free will. So she is disrespected for her weakness, love. She is in love with Edgardo and she professes her love for him, and her own brother Enrico curses her for it, I think in the second act. And so let's now break down the dramaturgy of Il Dolce Suono after having such a long and drawn out, I guess you can say, preamble to this presentation. So this again is Dame Joan Sutherland. And now we'll get into Il Dolce Suono and how we find out about Arturo's stabbing. So we as the audience don't explicitly see Lucia stab Arturo in their marriage chambers. Raimondo, the chaplain, instead announces to the celebrating masses that Lucia has gone mad. I think that this is a deliberate intention set by both the librettist Camerano and Donizetti, the composer, because Lucia's actions are announced to the chorus rather than viewed in person. So we understand and know of Lucia from her actions and choices, having a ripple effect on the people that hear of her, that perceive her, and the voices of people who attempt to control her, because Raimondo is not innocent in this. He plays a role in exerting control over Lucia. So we can understand implicitly as the audience that we are now voyeuristic and seeing into the lives of people who try to control Lucia for their own personal gain. And that also emphasizes the sort of pressure that Lucia is facing in her position. So now we talk about Lucia wielding the weapon of man to wound the ego of man. So Lucia uses Arturo's dagger to attack him, a dagger that in that portrayal I watched has Arturo carrying the dagger around his like waist. And so I have to preface this by saying that like at that time, with this friend group in particular, our understanding of literary analysis is from our English teacher, who loves to reference and invoke the writings of Freud, namely the life and death drive of Thanatos and Eros, as well as, and this was in Hedda Gabler, which was our kind of text that we had to analyze in our curriculum, but also Hedda Gabler's Venus Envy. So there is a lot of like phallus talk in this literary analysis. This is kind of like a stretch or a reach for me. And I'm sorry, I did not stretch before I reached, but like this is why I analyzed it that way. Like this presentation among friends, right? So the dagger shape and length could symbolize the phallus and suggest the power of the patriarchal society, especially emphasized through Arturo carrying it near his pelvis. So Lucia, so far being characterized as soft, weak, and inactive, uses the weapon of men to symbolically wound the ego of man. She not only subverts the docile expectation of her that we also engage in as the audience, but of other women. And I mean, if you've heard of this opera, then you know what's coming, right? But if this is the first time you're engaging with the text, this is a total 180 of like what's going on in the plot so far. So I feel like in my reading of this, Lucia, in her madness, finds strength and her agency. Or you can say the madness and hysteria is a vehicle for her to gain her agency back. And it is a condition, especially hysteria, sorry, historically associated with biological dysfunction. So she actually goes against the status quo, um, and she uses her biological dysfunction to kill someone, to enact her revenge. So good on her. So why is it good on her? Because this opera presents the people around her as people who violate her consent and her punishment for those who do that. So these men in Lucia's life violate her consent and undermine her free will to love who she wishes to. And it could certainly be believed that Arturo tried to consummate the marriage with Lucia against her will. And as such, Lucia wields Arturo's weapon and slays him in an act of justice, an act of personal justice, might I add. And in this moment, I am thinking of Artemisia Gentileschi's painting, which I will insert here. Um, and it just kind of makes me believe of women who have no way of speaking out, of no way of actually believing in the system to seek revenge for their behalf. And as such, these women often turn to creative pursuits or actual violence to seek out that personal revenge. At the same time, I want to go back to this. Why I say the weapon of man is because there's this sort of like idea, although it is not like concrete, but there's this idea of poison being a woman's weapon, whereas swords, daggers, and whatnot, these weapons are of hot war and for men to wield, whereas I feel like Lucia also subverts that gendered expectation of her to use gentler methods of violence like aqua tovana to kill men. So I think that is also something that could be mentioned here. So let's move on. So Lucia's entrance. Let me move this down so I can read the text. Lucia's entrance is quite compelling and interesting, in particular to the fact that she emerges from atop the staircase, entering the grand hall where everyone waits in shock horror. But before she does so, and even in the televised version of Dame Joan Sutherland's portrayal of Lucia, the actress, singer, they stab Arturo's dagger into the first landing. And this is a symbolic gesture. Well, this could be read as a symbolic gesture attacking, vanquishing, and rebuking the Ashton family estate, legacy, and their expectations of Lucia. And so, as such, Lucia frees herself from rigid social expectations to the crowd by exposing her madness for not only the audience, but the chorus. She shows her truth and she amends the narrative by living her hallucinations with Edgardo. She demonstrates that she really truly loves him and that she was not a willing participant in this marriage with Arturo. So next, I would like to tie in finally the glass harmonica or the harmonica. But this is an instrument that was, I guess you can, if you play a wine glass and then you like slowly circle your finger around the rim, it creates this reverberation. And this instrument is based on that concept. And so there's like a few conceptions of it. Either it's a series of glasses with different volumes of water within that the musician plays, or it's a series of singing bowls that are made of glass and stacked horizontally that spin, and the musician plays as such. And there's this really funny video that I saw online where the guy was like, I mean, you don't have to use water, blood works too, but if it dries out, then it's a problem.
I sliced my finger right up, still have the scar. Immediately, blood just went choo, and it spread, you know. And I was playing, well, blood still works until it starts to dry. Until it starts to dry.
And you just
And
can't
the
play
minute
that.
it just stops, and you stick to it. It becomes like glue, you know.
Whoa. That's powerful in the room. The dissonance is amazing.
Can you imagine in concert halls? People go bananas. Just for Solo, Glass Harmonica by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. He wrote it in 1791.
so the glass harmonica, it has been slowly phased out of being utilized in its performance, and now it is more commonly performed in accompaniment with a flautist, so someone who plays a flute. And so, again, the glass harmonica was something that was introduced in the 19th century for Lucia to sing with. Lucia's Madness aria is accompanied by this harmonica, and it creates this like sweet celestial sound that Lucia believes is the heavens smiling upon her blessed marriage with Edgardo. But this haunting melody of the glass harmonica is only heard by Lucia and us, the audience. So we are now taken on a subtle perspective switch from being the people that hear of Lucia's actions outside of the situation. We witness the ripple effects that happen with the larger society that Lucia lives in. And now we are inside her head. And now we are seeing from her perspective or hearing from her perspective of her fantasy, of her hallucinations. So Lucia's harmony with the glass harmonica sounds really haunted, and the reverberation sounds a bit like tinnitus, which engenders an unnerving feeling to Lucia's aria. And this, I believe, is the only performance that Lucia does solo throughout this entire opera. So it's the only time that she is unaccompanied by another voice who impedes the impact of her expressing her thoughts, her feelings, and it is a very impactful performance. The performance I watched was with the flute. I would just like to say that. I don't think there's very many people who know how to play a harmonica, a glass harmonica today. There are people, but I don't think people go to lengths to hire and bring in this instrument and musician just for a performance, which is kind of unfortunate, but because it sounds amazing. And I'll cut in a video later on. But so now we'll talk about the costuming of Lucia's madness. And so Lucia, in certain adaptations, emerges in her nightgown, in her undergarments, or in her wedding dress. And so, but she is often clothed in white. And so this whiteness suggests death, innocence, purity, and rebirth. And so the old Lucia, the one who tempers her own actions and fears of the consequences should she expose her love and affair, well, not affair, but like tryst with Edgardo, is now deceased. She's rebirthed into someone who, through her madness, expresses in the most purest and unadulterated way that she has desires for Edgardo. And so Lucia's gown is spattered with Arturo's blood, the blood of one of the men who infringe upon her consent. And so the crimson is a stark reminder of Lucia's psychological wound, but in some adaptations, because it's close to her chest, the blood can also signify her broken heart, but also of the great misunderstanding or romanticization of madness, because I don't think people die from madness like that. I do think that there is certainly an effect on the longevity of a person, especially we understand now that loneliness and other like sadness can greatly impede the circulatory system and lead to heart disease, but not so much like dying straight after like a psychosis. So anyway, in some adaptations, Arturo's blood is spilled near her lower abdomen and reproductive organ. I've not had the pleasure of seeing these adaptations, but I have seen the pictures, which is why I included this analysis. But the Arturo's blood being spilled near her lower abdomen and reproductive organ could suggest or be a commentary on reproductive rights, especially with Trump's administration at this time, and consent and marital rape, which are all three very pertinent, or you can say very poignant topics for the fate of people who can reproduce in this day and age. So, and whether they have that control over their right to. So this is the glass harmonica. The slides are switched, and even after all of these recordings, I have forgotten to switch around the slides. So yeah, my bad. So this is the final slide, but not the final topic that I will be discussing. And this is like the closing argument as to why Lucia's madness, for me, is an integral part or vehicle for her emancipation. So even from this picture, you can see that everyone's looking down and closing in on Lucia, and she's the only one wearing white. Everybody else is wearing black, and it suggests that they are all complicit in that subjugation of Lucia, in her eventual madness, and in her emotional turmoil. So now back to the argument. Lucia kills Arturo, freeing her from the marriage contract that she was made to sign without her consent. And that is the most straightforward way of explaining away why her madness allows her to be free. Enrico also finally shows remorse for his actions after Lucia goes mad and dies. And so understanding that in her madness, Lucia exacts her revenge, lasting grief, remorse, and guilt. And if you are a Catholic or a former Catholic, you will know that guilt is kind of like the biggest, heaviest punishment that you can feel. And that's what you have to grapple with. That's what Enrico has to grapple with. And that is Lucia's revenge upon Enrico, her own brother who betrayed her. Lucia's hallucinations also lead her to believe that she has married Edgardo, and as such, her hallucinations allow her to live her desired reality, even though it is facilitated through psychosis or a psychotic illness. And so Lucia's agency is restored through her hysteria or her madness, a normally considered, I guess you can say, biological dysfunction that people may have had at the time. Like that picture of biological dysfunction that people may have associated with at the time. So she acts without consideration of the implied weight of her actions. She no longer fears the consequences or externalities of being with Edgardo. And she is no longer weighed down by this grappling of these externalities. And you can say that she's the only one with this moral regard. Nobody else in this opera stops to think what they are doing before they try to use Lucia for their personal ambitions. So in some sense, Lucia is still the best character in this opera, and she is just so unfortunate to be born into this family and not being able to live her freedom, to live her love, to live, laugh, love. And yeah, that is why I believe Lucia's madness is integral to her emancipation and why she ascends into her madness rather than descends into madness. Because she had lived the entire opera, which is like almost 3 hours, in rock bottom until she goes mad. And then afterwards, we, the audience, really feel that she is coming into her own rightful desired reality where she gets to be with Edgardo, where she frees herself from all these people who try to control her. So one interesting question that my friend asked me was regarding this televised performance by Dame Joan Sutherland. So I'll switch back to that slide. Okay, so in this performance, he comments that she, in her costume, there isn't much of a blood spatter that is visible. Rather, it is largely a white flowy gown. So he inquires whether that is a deliberate decision that the costuming department tried to establish a more of a sympathetic light toward Lucia by portraying her as this pure figure. And how it contrasts with the now contemporary adaptations of Lucia di Lammermoor, where the actress is drenched in blood. So you can see from these images that I've taken past these slides that Lucia, even if dressed in traditional garb, has more blood that is noticeable on her dress. And this like reminiscent of Carrie. So I wasn't really able to answer this question because one, I'm not really a performance expert on opera, but I theorized that perhaps it was because there was not very many people that were in the audience when this performance was televised, and perhaps because of the image quality that we aren't really able to see the blood spatter. Whether that is an intentional choice by the department, I'm not sure. But I also might comment that it depends on the way that we read the text as people who assign a final meaning and interpretation to the text. And Donizetti and Camerano's text was not finished when they premiered this opera. Rather, after we, the audience, watched this text and came away with our own meanings of Lucia di Lammermoor, that Lucia was finally finished and complete as an opera. So today it still exists in many different adaptations. I think that personally, there could have been another technical reason that I think perhaps now opera houses are way larger to garner more profits, to seat more people in one singular performance. And as such, the blood is very dramatic because it needs to be observed and seen through all the lighting and through all that distance where people are sitting in like higher upper wings, to be able to see that blood. Because it is definitely a very, very central and integral part of the narrative. Um, Similarly, I would like to say that I personally think and believe that having more blood lends more dramatic effect, especially if we go back to that title slide that I did. Lucia's hands, garbs are all drenched in Arturo's blood, and she is even like carrying her dagger down to the staircase while she's surrounded by all these people. I do think that like they tried to establish this really stark contrast between the way that Lucia was portrayed or characterized in that first and second act of the opera. And then in this third and final act, when Lucia snaps, um, her like the severing of her from her mental facilities leads her to become this person who in her madness kills Arturo. But in doing so, it's this really cathartic moment because we wanted that resolution for her in that first place, that we wanted her to be free. So we hyper identify with Lucia in that sense, and that blood being a very prominent evidence of her freedom is something that we applaud for. And I can say that because very, very many people around me in that theater from that adaptation were low-key cheering and like moving around in their seats when she came out in like all of that blood. So I would also like to say that the blood is the employment of such a large amount of blood is also a added dramatic effect, that may also suggest that other themes of consent, reproductive rights, marital rape, and all of that. So that is also something that could be tied into this discussion, but we don't really know. And it's also subjective, right? So that is kind of the way that I personally read this opera, especially Lucia's madness scene, and why I believe that her madness is an ascent and is her vehicle for emancipation from the people around her. Thank you. I think this is the best one yet. I don't think I missed out any points. So let's just hope I pressed record. I'm going to stop sharing first. Great. It has been recorded.